Namaste everyone, I'm Roshan Karyappa. Welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. India's relations with China has been an acute focus post the Galwan incident some weeks ago. While military options are an operational necessity, India is also thinking of trade and economic options from a more strategic perspective. And that is indeed what we'll be discussing today. So we have Ashish Chandorkar, who's an author and public policy expert joining us from Pune. Hey, Ashish.
Hey, Carrie. Hi.
We have Harsh Gupta, who's an economist and author as well, joining us from Kolkata. Hey, Harsh.
Hi, Carrie. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. And finally, we have Rajiv Mantri, who's an investor and author, joining us from Kolkata as well. Hey, Rajiv.
Yeah. Hi, Carrie.
Good to have you all. Harsh, we'll start with you. Maybe you can help us understand a little bit of an overview on India and China trade relations.
Okay, thank you. So I'll give you very tough numbers because they keep on changing year on year. Roughly, Indian, it's about $80 billion of imports from China to India, approximately, and about $20 billion of exports from India to China. And therefore, India runs a bilateral trade deficit of about $60 billion. So this is the rough number for, say, calendar year 2019. So as you can see, the trade is on a bilateral basis very lopsided. India imports a lot of industrial goods, intermediate goods, finished goods, chemicals, electronics. All of them are slightly decreasing, but we are in the very early stages of that. And till fairly recently, we were exporting commodities to China, Supreme Court decisions with respect to Karnataka and Goa might have reduced that a bit, but it was almost like colonial terms of trade between India and China. How the stereotypical developed economy or the colonial economy, the metropole, would export finished goods and would import raw materials from the colonized economy or the emerging economy. And the terms of, and by the way, this trade completely exploded only in the middle of the first decade of this century. So around 2003, 4, 5, it really started exploding when the UPA came in, and a few years after the WTO had China as a member. Before that, trade wasn't that big, and definitely the deficit wasn't that huge. Now, bilateral trade deficit in terms of economics is not a very meaningful number. What matters is the overall trade deficit, in turn, the overall current account deficit, which is necessarily the opposite of a capital account surplus. But economics is only one part of it. It really matters a lot when it comes to geopolitics. If you have actually a very lopsided trade relationship, in this case, India importing much more than exporting, then that gives India relative leverage when it comes to certain geopolitical tensions, as we saw recently. Now, China uniquely, for example, runs, if I'm not wrong, a trade deficit with Japan, with South Korea, where they in turn import more finished goods, and with Australia, although they import more raw materials from Australia. With ASEAN, it's about even Stevens. And one of the problems with India-China trade is not all of the trade is covered in the official numbers. A lot goes through Hong Kong, I don't know, maybe some through Macau, but a lot of it is increasingly being diverted through the ASEAN region as well. India has a free trade agreement with ASEAN. It does not have one with China. And a lot of Chinese companies are legitimately going to Vietnam, for example. And how much value add is there being done in Vietnam? Or is it basically just transshipment without the rules of origin being followed or not, as the trade agreement between India and ASEAN is required? It's very unclear, and it's probably being abused to some extent. To what is the extent is difficult to quantify on any real-time or ongoing basis. So the long story short, the India-China trade relationship is extremely lopsided. India, this is one of the big reasons for the rest of the world's deindustrialization on a relative basis, but especially for India. In India's deindustrialization, or should I say, percentage of manufacturing value add as fraction of GDP, the reason why it's, depending how you count, stabilizing 15%, is I would say a large part of that is because of China. Our entrepreneurs basically became importers. There were many problems on our side in terms of reforms, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. but they never really had the incentive to actually go out and become manufacturers. Most of them became traders and importers. And that is only now slowly that India is trying to solve with Make in India. The question there is how much protectionism to use there versus how much to be clued into global supply chains, which are increasingly China centric, and how that will now change after the American Chinese new Cold War and the global pandemic. So, how do you kind of be in a supply chain without being too dependent on China? That's the kind of finessing that India will have to do going forward.
Right, right. So if we were to consider reducing a trade deficit, Rajiv, how would you go about doing it? And is that the right way to look at this this problem as such?
So to address this, if we need to do that, I think India has to improve productivity, improve its competitiveness. We need reforms in all kinds of sectors as well as factor markets. I think some important changes were brought in the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, and there was the discussion on labor law reforms as well. But it seems to have gone quiet again. So we'll have to watch where that goes. To raise India's competitiveness to the level where we can sort of compete with China and export markets, or even replace it. Frankly, it is going to take time. It cannot happen quickly. But having said that, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. This is a great opportunity for India to sort of push forward with those necessary steps, which are always delayed or sidetracked or torpedoed by vested interests.
Right. So Ashish, any comments on what specifically we can aim to replace?
Yeah, Kerry, I think we need to look at this problem in a we need to break it down. Actually, the moment you look at the trade deficit of 60 billion, it's actually, I think in the FY20 we will end with 49. The previous year was, as Harsh said, close to about 53, and before that it was 63. So 63 in 17, 18, then 53, and now 49. It's a big number. So there's no point in attacking the number as a whole, because there are several areas where we do not really have. Where the dependence on China will stay. It's unfortunate, but you are not going to basically be able to replace that immediately. What matters is to understand what you can really replace from China. And I'll give you some examples. Okay, if you look at the items which there are, for which the total import value is, let's say, less than $100 million, right? There are several such items, about 800 products, where the import value of each standalone is less than 100 million, but the combined value of the imports is about $4 billion. Okay. And these include stuff like, wide variety of things like organic chemicals, machinery, textile, tools, metals, toys, furniture, stone items, decorative items, plastic kind of stuff, and several like ceramic products and so on, right? So these are the things which there's no reason why India cannot replace that pretty much straight away. It's not very complicated manufacturing. Plus, we do have manufacturers also in India, so it's not like we have no one making these. And as the recent example of the PPE equipment and even the ventilators show that basically if your processes work in tandem with your risk takers, where government supports a quick ramp up, it only takes 2 to 3 months to really make a real difference. So, for example, for PPE equipment, India had 2 manufacturers in end of Feb when the pandemic hit us. Today, we are like the second largest exporter, or we could be the second largest exporter if the export was allowed of some of the protective equipment. So this about 800 products where we have very little. Value-wise, it's not much basically, right? But we are just importing it because we have become lazy, and as Harsh said, manufacturers have become traders, so they would rather close their factory and import from China because that is cheaper. Yeah. So I think that, of course, and as Rajiv said, like a lot of this happens in the MSME sector. So the reforms which have been talked about, hopefully, some of them will play out. But as players become even fractionally more competitive, it doesn't need to mean that we have to become cheaper than China. Actually, people may, because at a unit level, we're talking about a few rupees of extra cost, right? So it's not going to hurt too much for the consumer. But at an aggregate level, even if your productivity improves by let's say a reasonable fraction, 15-20%, that can make a whole lot of difference to part of the imports. So we need to break down this entire deficit of 50-60 billion which we incur, and then target it phase by phase and make like a 2 to 3 year plan where we can reduce it over. I mean, the deficit has been built over 17 years. I mean, we were about a $500 million in deficit at the start of the century. We were actually in almost neck to neck in 97, 98. The deficit started in 2000, and Harsh said starting 2003 it has just ballooned. So from almost $500 million, we have gone to peak of 63 billion at the end of FY 2017. So you cannot undo this in one stroke. It's not an electrical switch where you just switch on, switch off. But over 2-3 years, you can easily reduce it by, let's say, half. And that should be very realistic.
Right. So Harsh, I want to pick up on something.
Hari, I'll just add to what Ashish said with your permission.
I was just going to ask you about that. Yes. So just to unpack whatever he mentioned in a little more detail, right? So assuming that, the cost arbitrage disappears and it's more viable for, or rather people don't have an option but to manufacture, let's say, phosphates or chemicals or ceramics or etc. Within India, how do you see that playing out, and what is the time frame that you would take to say that we would become competitive on those fronts?
So I don't know, it's very difficult. Time frame would obviously depend from industry to industry, but I think 3 to 5 years is a good benchmark for most industries or most subsectors. So you mentioned ceramics, and I was just adding to Ashish's point. I just read an article, I think Rajiv only sent me, saying that in Morbi, Gujarat, which is where is the hub of India's ceramic and tiles manufacturers, like for example, Kajaria, Somani, and so on and so forth. But right now, because of the kind of slump in residential real estate, the pandemic, and so on and so forth, they have a lot of extra manufacturing capacity. They're near the coast, they're very entrepreneurial people. They said, okay, so instead of wasting time, let's kind of ramp up basic toys manufacturing, which they are now doing that with very small investments. And they just kind of written a letter to the PMO saying, if you could just give us some support on the trade policy side for some time, nothing very special, we could really double down on the investments because we have spare capacity. And if you think about that, that's a very good example of a broader trend. See what happened starting around 2003 to 2012, that kind of weak dollar period when all the emerging markets were booming, and Indian credit in some years was increasing, bank credit was increasing 30% year on year. We were basically supply constrained. And if you remember blackouts in 2012-13, those basically now history more or less, except in very small parts of the country. At that point, when we were supply constrained, it made sense from a short term, or at most a short to medium term, to import some stuff from China when the geopolitical rivalry was also not that big. Anyways, we were really going gangbusters on the services export side. What happened is, after the downturn of 2012-13, the taper tantrum of 2013, a lot of capacity that was in line, anyways, the projects were being completed, we suddenly had excess capacity across sectors. I mean, power is the most notable example, but if you look at steel, if you look at cement, etc., right? And suddenly, and that by the way happened at different periods of time, but roughly around the same time across the whole world. China, for example, produces about 1 billion tons of steel a year, right? We produce about 100 million tons of steel per year. Approximately, it's just 10 times more. So what happened is, suddenly now our spare capacity really started hurting our profit margins and therefore reinvestment. But China could easily dump for them what was a rounding error and just kind of cover up a few markets on its periphery, as it says, which is India and ASEAN. So what has changed is the complete context here. So we have excess capacity, depending on RBI numbers, we are in the 70s of capacity utilization before the pandemic. How do we get that number up? Because if you don't get the number up, you won't have new investment, you won't have private capex. And therefore, we need a combination of a lower currency, a weaker rupee, some protectionism without becoming excessive, more infrastructure, what Rajiv mentioned about reforms, what Ashish mentioned about targeting very specific sectors. And the example I gave you now, for example, it's organically happening in sector after sector. And I'm very bullish about this happening because unlike the economists, the abstract economists kind of scoff at the term import substitution because of a certain connotation given our modern history. If you go by annual reports of companies, they very matter-of-factly, without any connotation, positive or negative, say we are actually indulging in import substitution of 3 products this year. Next fiscal, we are going to import substitute 2 more products, and we are doing backward integration or forward integration. And I think I am seeing this across industries as somebody who is professionally involved in the public markets. I really think it's just we need more government support. And as Rajiv said, crisis is a very terrible thing to waste. The pandemic has finally given us that backdrop, along with this geopolitical tension in terms of trade, in terms of interest rates, to get very serious about it. But to answer your direct question, I think 3 to 5 years is good enough for India to be competitive across a lot of sectors and subsectors.
Right. And, Rajiv, Harsh mentioned protectionism, right? What is it that we can reasonably do without hurting business? Any ideas on that front?
See, it has to be a very, obviously, whenever we talk about these issues, they are at a kind of a higher level. But when you start getting into the weeds, you have to take a very specific industry by industry approach. Like Ashi said, there are certain things which we can't escape, where actually there are certain items. I can give you an example. Certain items that use rare earth metals, for example, electronics. So those kind of components, those kind of products. Now China has a kind of a monopoly globally in rare earths, and increasingly they are used a lot for all the consumer electronics that we love to use. Now, chances are that for some time China will continue to have a dominance in that category, and it's hard to sort of escape that dominance because they control the supply, or rather, going back one more step in the supply chain, they control the raw material for that. And obviously, China is not going to be exporting its rare earth metals. So it has to be a very sector by sector approach. It has to be, it can't be something where it is driven by kind of reactiveness. So it requires like careful planning, I would say.
Okay. So I think so far what we've discussed would be relatively defensive options, right? But Harsh, on a previous episode, we've spoken about agriculture reforms, labor reforms, etc., and taking some of this business away from China. Given the whole corona pandemic world that we're living in, right, where China's trust deficit has grown with the world as such, right? So if you look at it as a more aggressive option in terms of that, how can we go about doing that? How can we take a more aggressive approach to this?
Well, I really don't think there's, the aggressive and defensive approaches are basically the same. It's just a flip side of each other. I think the divergence started when we rightly did not sign the RCEP trade pact last year. There were a lot of noises within the Indian establishment saying it's good, we need to join, we need to sign. Till recently, many people are saying so. And I think that was that, along with, the Belt and Road Initiative, which India did not join, the Doklam kind of standoff, along with obviously this actual violent kinetic standoff that happened in the Galwan Valley. It's now very clear that things will not go back to the status quo ante, right? Things will be different going forward. I think in terms of taking business, what you can do aggressively is what India is going to do. India will not just do trade policy as I mentioned about, say 5, 10, 15%. By the way, trade policy protectionism is not just about increasing tariffs. It might be in some cases decreasing tariffs on imports from China when they are intermediate inputs. For example, depending if you know that in the next 3-4 years, this is something you do not want to build. Say not all APIs, but a certain kind of API in pharma, or a certain kind of chemical for textiles. You can actually reduce the tariff on that and increase the tariff on the finished good. At least you want to make sure that the finished good never has, lower tariffs than the raw material itself, which we often had, was known as tariff inversion, which actually disincentivizes value add manufacturing in India. So part of that is the trade policy, but part of that is also industrial policy. So now the government is coming out with extensive, almost direct industrial subsidies for electronic manufacturers, especially smartphone manufacturers and consumer electronics of all kinds, to basically get up and set up shop in India. at the union government level as well as many state government levels. So it seems like, around Chennai, around Noida, that we are kind of coming up with new electronic kind of clusters, similar to the way we had Pune and Gujarat and Tamil Nadu again, along with Haryana, Manesar, as auto clusters. So there seems to be a very open return of industrial and trade policy both. I think the next step in terms of aggressiveness, what I think can be done is all these policies, most of them are country agnostic, at least de jure, if not de facto, right? Most of them are de facto aimed at China, but de jure they're country agnostic, except for the investment protection or investment restriction that we had even before the Galwan Valley thing, when we said neighboring countries will have certain restrictions on foreign investment in India, right? I mean, neighboring Pakistan and Bangladesh are not really investing in India, right? It's basically China. But I think on trade policy as well, I think the next aggressive step is to try to form a concert of democracies. Because see, in India, the problem with protectionism, even though India has become a more competent state under a more honest administration, is protectionism is only very good unlike pure economists, I don't say it's never good. I think it's good, but I'm saying it's not good as a long-term solution. So it can only work if simultaneously, for example, have free trade pacts with the UK, with Canada, with the European Union, with the United States. And the problem with the United States is they put in intellectual property and investment, and it's not really a trade pact anymore. But we need to have more trade pacts with countries that are at a different stage of economic growth. See, when China happened, China had no China to outcompete. What I mean by that is there was no large country which was the factory of the world. It was the first time offshoring actually happened from Japan, South Korea, Germany, and the United States. Now, India, the Chinese have not gone. Yes, they've gone up on value addition, but they have massive economies of scale, right? Their manufacturing sector is about 10 times larger than India's. So for India to do what the Chinese did, I mean, the Chinese did it in the WTO framework. For India to do it in any kind of global framework will be difficult. It will sooner or later, for geopolitical and economic reasons, defensive and aggressive, have to have more trade within friendly democracies, and will have to kind of start sidelining China, because you do not want a 20% tariff on certain goods when you really are aiming it at China, to also apply to Sweden or Norway or Nokia or the US, because you want specialization to happen across that for now. So the aggressive step is to actually starting to name and shame China. But I think that cannot be done by India alone. That will have to be a concerted effort. And I don't think that can happen before we have a new president or the same president getting re-elected in the US.
Kerry, I'll just add to that. See, a lot of the question around defensive and offensive mechanisms boils down to a lot of rhetoric in the Indian commentary, right? So, for example, see, the fact is that you're not going to become the factory of the world tomorrow. You're not going to replace China anytime soon, right? So the actions which we take, first, we should ensure that we solve our problem, which is that we have a large enough market, which is obviously, you can see that China is exporting so much to India. So clearly there's a problem to be solved there. I think only when we get the economies of scale in our own market, where people can experiment, probably fail here and there, improve quality, do some trial and error, that is the point at which we'll start exporting, right? See, the challenge is that a lot of the policy prescriptions in India become very rhetorical in nature, right? So it's like people think that, okay, fine, now that we have Atmanirbhar, so from tomorrow, there's no China involved in the world. I mean, it doesn't work like that, right? Also, the disengagement, or whatever we want to call it, I mean, even if it's a full disengagement with China, will still be gradual in nature. For example, their capital is still okay. I mean, as long as they don't take control of our companies, right? So, I mean, about 15 unicorns in India have got sizable Chinese investments. So, I mean, Chinese capital, right? And clearly, capital is one area where India will not be able to replace China anytime soon. I mean, there is a reason why companies were raising capital from these firms. So the fact is that, and of course, even there, a couple of companies have said that they are willing to offload the Chinese stake if someone is willing to buy. But these are all gradual things, right? So there's no point in getting into the rhetoric that we have to replace China, or we are going to become the factory of the world tomorrow, etc. A large part, this is a very it's a war of attrition, right? It is a 5-year war of attrition. I mean, China in its own policy documents say that they are fighting a 100-year war, and by 100-year I mean they're 30 years away now for completing that 100 years which started in 1950. But the fact is that at least for our own manufacturing, it has to be a 5 to 10 years war. It's not going to happen immediately, right? So the government also needs continuity, irrespective of which government is there in Delhi. The policies have to be fairly continuous, and the reason why we are here is actually the discontinuity which happened in between the Vajpayee and the Manmohan regimes, right? Like that was the transition point where the whole the trade deficit ballooned up. So I think that we need to avoid that. I think that will be very important, and I think to my mind that itself will be offensive in the sense that local politics aligning towards the cause itself will be a fairly offensive step with respect to containing China.
Yeah, I mean, people tend to think of foreign policy as like, like a schoolyard fight between bullies sometimes. So, I mean, like a lot of people objected to Prime Minister Modi not, on his statements on Galwan as well, right? Without even understanding maybe 10% of what happens, behind the screens. So, Rajiv, I think Harsh also has spoken earlier, and he has alluded to some of it on the podcast now as well, right? Which is state activism through policy directives, right? So how do you think we should go about doing that?
No, I think it would be a mixture of 2-3 things. One is obviously kind of limited tariffs and selective kind of targeted tariffs like that. Other will be internal liberalization. So sort of reforms domestically, freeing up our own capital, labor, land markets, all the good stuff that we discussed before on the podcast, and that has been debated so heavily over the last several years. And finally, I think the point that Harsh raised on inking kind of free trade agreements with friendly countries, that would include most countries in Western Europe and North America, and kind of coming to an agreement so that we get access to their markets to export. So I think a mixture of these 3 approaches would for sure yield results.
Right. So Harsh, you're a fan of both economics and politics. So the question to you is, how do you make sure that these policies continue irrespective of what government is in charge in Delhi?
So I actually think these policies will continue now, irrespective of which government is in Delhi. I mean, if I wear my partisan leaning hat, I would probably not say that, because then there is less fear of the opposition then. But anyways, the opposition is not really kind of evoking much fear or anything right now. So that's fine. I don't think it will change. I don't think it will change in any mature democracy. I think even in the US, no matter who wins, it will change. In the UK, no matter who wins, it will change, because these things do not change that quickly based on. Remember, it wasn't like that Vajpayee had any kind of trade restrictions on China. But as Ashish rightly mentioned, trade deficit wasn't a big issue with China then. But we didn't have any coherent trade or industrial policy with respect to China back then. It's only now that we're seeing it's a massive problem, and it's kind of snowballed into a geopolitical and military problem. So it would be very difficult for any government to actually go back on that. For example, now that the Modi government...
No, and I just want to add one thing on that.
Go ahead, Rajiv. Go ahead.
So just to add one point, what Harsh is saying, I think so the problem with UPA 1 was that reforms came to a standstill. Internal liberalization kind of came to a standstill. And that kind of, people weren't realizing it at that time, because obviously there's 7-8% growth, consistent sort of numbers being printed, GDP numbers being printed like that. Thus, there was a complacency. But I think that was the real damage, actually, that India stopped reforming for those, nearly a decade. And there have been a lot of people who've analyzed this, written about this. And I think not just in an economic sense, in a kind of trade competitiveness sense, but even in a geopolitical sense, that did set us back.
No, I fully agree. I mean, trade and to some extent, internal reforms, to some extent, infrastructure as well. While some infrastructure was made, especially in terms of private power and all of that, hardly any metros were made outside of Delhi. Vajpayee did a lot of good stuff on highways. Manmohan Singh did a lot of good stuff on rural roads, but did not kind of go to the next level of highways in terms of expressways, which now Modi is doing. So and especially, for example, private ports in a very big way started happening towards the end, but not really. But to go back to the point, for example, now that India has banned TikTok, and I'm assuming it remains banned, there is no quid pro quo in terms of the border or LAC disengagement. So assume it remains banned. It would be very difficult for a new government to come back and unban 59 Chinese apps. And speaking about offensive actions or aggressive actions, even getting beyond rhetoric, as Ashish mentioned, that single action has basically stopped in the tracks the globalization of the Chinese consumer tech, right? I mean, any sovereign wealth fund or any crazy Japanese billionaire, I'm not going to take a name, is not going to write a check to Chinese companies with the assumption that these companies can go global anymore, because they've seen that the politics and privacy and data security will always come in the picture. And therefore now, in a way, see, because digital tech, just remaining on the topic for a second, is such a winner takes all market, by kind of kicking out China from global markets, in effect, India is kind of creating space for itself as well. I mean, of course, over and beyond American companies. So India has taken aggressive steps, and to this specific question, I think irrespective of who comes to power, they will stick. I mean, I'm not saying the Communist Party comes to power and it sticks, but then I don't think the Communist Party comes to power.
Kerry, just to add, I mean, I am a little less sanguine about the whole political situation. See, the problem in India is that it is difficult to distinguish what is
of you, Ashish. Not at all optimistic like Harsh.
I'm usually quite optimistic actually, but on this one, I think that in India it's very difficult to distinguish between incompetence and complicity, right? So what, and I mean in politics, what you think is incompetence could actually be very nicely orchestrated piece of policies by some vested interests, and because these things are very opaque, you don't know until very late what's going on. I'll take an example. So like when we did not sign the RCEP, I think some of the folks on this podcast were the only ones who were very vocally happy about it, right? Like we've been discussing even on social media, etc., why RCEP would have been a disaster for India. But go back and look at the op-eds which came out, right? Even the retired bureaucrats and the usual decoration set of Indian media, I mean, everyone basically wrote about how Modi government is afraid of globalization, why we are not confident about yourselves. By the way, this also included people who visibly support this government. Okay. The challenge is that one section of Indian commentariat is very idealistic in its view, very doctrinaire in its view, and it gets played by the vested interests in the name of being, like being fully open and being fully liberal about how we trade with the world. But the fact is that Indian economy today is one of the most open economies. You should read some of the, if you go to LinkedIn and check some of the what Indian entrepreneurs are writing about their experience of business in China. It's terrible, right? Like how I mean, it's very difficult to access the Chinese market. And my worry is that, sure, no one is going to come out and on record say that, okay, fine, we are going back on our aggressive stance against China, but the policies may get tweaked here and there. And since Indian rules are fairly complex, all it needs is like some very small tweak in a very complicated rule, which only the 10-15 impacted entrepreneurs will understand what it means. And then basically the whole things get reversed, not because someone says so on record, but because there was probably a vested interest and someone got it done. So I'm a little less optimistic on the political side of it, because the politics in India, as in most of the large democracies, is getting very, very polarized at this stage. And I mean, of course, one other thing is like how does the world behave with respect to China? Like if there's a change in leadership in the US, again, I mean, I know Harsh alluded to that even the US, there's a continuity in US, but I'm also not very optimistic about that either. I feel that if the regime changes in the US, there could be many more concessions to China. Yes, the headline items may not change. So you may not change the TikTok ban, or you may not change, let's say, the Huawei involvement in the 5G networks. But I think at a more operational level, the momentum towards not importing tiles and toys and Diwali decoration items, I think that can be easily reversed by any bureaucrat at a much, much lower level.
So I'll respond to that. First of all, I largely agree. I think, we should. It's a very fair point what Ashish is making. We should always be paranoid. Just because we have been lucky with the leadership with respect to these issues, it is easy to forget the bad days of 2006-7 when all kind of compromises were being made. I mean, already disclosures are happening in terms of the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, who gave money. Some embassy gave money, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a very fair point that Ashish is making. I think having said that, actually, even though it feels like that, Indian politics is probably less polarized than American politics, in the sense that of all the world leaders consistently amongst democracies, I mean, I'm just ignoring Putin and his numbers. Even he polls less. Narendra Modi is consistently one of the most popular leaders across the world. So it might seem the Indian democracy is polarized when it comes to certain upper middle class English speaking elite on social media. But I think election after election is showing at least at the national level, not necessarily at the state level, it is actually not polarized. So maybe part of that, maybe part of the domination of that narrative is because the Indian public at the union level is still not trusting the opposition. And if and when opposition makes very clear that you can trust us on these basic national security issues, then that's the only time they can win, and therefore at that point you don't really worry about them changing these policies. But having said that, I fully agree with Ashish that we should not. I should not be very blasé about dismissing these kind of concerns. So that's a point well taken. Back to you, Caddy.
Yeah, Rajiv, actually, I want to talk to you about the TikTok ban. And the implications from that, right? Of course, China has probably banned Amir Khan movies in their country, I suppose. I didn't know that he was such a big deal there, but anyway, right? We're seeing that this can also have a snowballing effect in terms of other countries following suit and increased focus on data privacy, localization, etc. Right? So, from a tech perspective, how do you see this sort of playing out?
So let me take that, Carrie. Actually, I had a couple of views on that topic which you raised, right? So, see, TikTok ban. Someone had to tell. Like, I think someone tweeted about this, right? Someone had to tell that the emperor was naked, and India has done that, right? Now it's up to the world to basically pick up on that theme and carry on from there. The fact is that the concerns which we have outlined, and as I think I completely agree with what Harsh said, that hopefully this ban has nothing to do with the border clash, because your data was anyway going to get stolen irrespective of whether a border clash happened or not. So the fact is that, and the same is true for other countries, right? So I really hope some other countries do follow up on this, because until until there's a strong action globally, these concerns will not go away. So in that sense, the larger data privacy concerns, if they become weaponized in terms of the regulatory protectionism, it could actually completely kill Chinese industry. Also do note that Chinese services exports, by the way, have also grown significantly. I mean, India used to export about 60 odd billion in services, and China was doing 20-30 billion. But last year, China actually almost caught up. I mean, they're upwards of 40-45 billion in their services exports also. And a lot of that is coming from the new tech world. And also from the telecom type stuff, right? So if the data privacy becomes a question in itself, that could hurt China in new frontiers. And it's not just about the Indian losing the 200 odd million users in India of TikTok. It's actually going to be a death knell for several Chinese tech companies. So it's actually a very potent weapon for us as long as other countries cooperate.
Yeah.
So also, Carrie, I had also tweeted this, that the ban on TikTok is also kind of a gift to American tech giants. So just Alphabet and Facebook, between them, have about, I think, something like 80% of online ad spends globally. TikTok was emerging as a platform that could challenge that. So now that it's gone down in India, and there are noises in the US coming in now that they may take similar action, I think that could, if the US does take any kind of a step like that, I think it will have severe repercussions. So the only platform that could have taken on American tech, will lose immediately. And as Harsh said, many investors will re-rate Chinese tech companies based on such kind of geopolitically driven policy actions.
Yeah, and some of these companies are also at a ridiculous valuation, right? I mean, ByteDance, for example, is like upwards of $100 billion, and Tencent, I'm sure, will be around that, whatever, right? So surely there is some sort of an impact. And when some of these consumer internet companies or whatever, I mean, anyway they look at India, right, in for scale. Now, I mean, it's even more. I mean, that option is off the table anyway, right? So yeah.
So in fact, there was a news report that ByteDance is looking to change its headquarters, move out of China, try to paint itself as a non-Chinese company to try to escape this kind of scrutiny.
Yeah.
And let's see how far that goes.
But
it just shows that how powerful the impact of India's move has been. That a lot of governments are thinking about this seriously now.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, there was also this kind of viral tweet on VC Twitter, where somebody tried to use a Chinese app in America, one of those Chinese live streaming apps, and the app immediately identified them as not from China, and it kind of cut them off. So it's kind of funny that people are realizing it now that the so-called splinternet has always existed.
Yeah.
And the Chinese internet has been what it is. The rest of the world has had an open internet, but the Chinese are allowed to play in the open world, whereas the other companies can't go to China. So I think now people are viscerally kind of realizing that.
Right. So Harsh, I mean, people have been warning about China's economic imperialism for quite a while, right? Whether it's like through things that they've been doing in Africa, or even here right now in Nepal and elsewhere, right? People like Steve Bannon, for example, have cried hoarse about this. But somehow, people haven't taken it seriously, or I mean, it's been a cookie view in some sense or whatever, right? Surely, I mean, at this point of time, all conspiracy theories on that front are validated.
Hi, Gary. Yes. So I'm not sure how much there is a conspiracy here as such, but it's a clear case of vested interests in the West, dominating over their own national interests, and in turn, the broader democratic world's interests being hurt. So, for example, the U.S. Treasury Secretary is often somebody from the investment banking background. Goldman Sachs has had multiple Treasury Secretaries, and the Chinese state, the Chinese elite, have been dangling the carrot of their financial sector gradually opening to the American financial multinationals, slowly going towards capital account convertibility, even though they've taken a few steps back since 2015-16. Blackstone, Goldman Sachs, even Bridgewater. Ray Dalio is a guy who apparently gets a lot of access to the Chinese Communist Party and is relatively gung-ho about the future in a very amoral manner. He's not necessarily defending their situation, but he's not necessarily criticizing it either. So it's a very clear case of. What's that, please?
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say there was this conspiracy about, I don't know if it's a conspiracy. I mean, there's this whole connection between Biden's son and the Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese and honestly the Russians have been buying the elites and their relatives, or at least trying very hard for the last few decades. And that's just a classic kind of closed or almost closed society playing off the weaknesses in open society. And that risk is only now being understood in a perhaps more exaggerated manner in terms of Russian interference, fake news, and so on and so forth. This has always happened. A former German chancellor, I'm forgetting his name, Schroeder, he ended up working for the Russian gas company after his retirement.
Gerhard
Schroeder. So, these kind of people have always been there, and the Chinese have been trying to buy Western elites, just like they've been trying to buy Indian elites. I'm assuming Indian elites sell for cheaper, which is why you had the Rajiv Gandhi establishment, the center in Delhi getting these donations and so on and so forth. It's quite blatant and almost in your face if somebody actually follows the crumbs. So I think that risk is there, but ultimately I think what has changed is public opinion on this issue has changed, changing this from a technocratic foreign policy issue to an issue that is up front and center. So now the China issue is not something that, okay, well, we'll defer to the Council of Foreign Relations, or only the guys who know diplomatics or who work in think tanks will have the right view on that. there is a public position in all the world's major democracies about China. And therefore, I think it is very difficult now, even if some elites are bought or purchased. And as Ashish rightly mentioned, we have to be very careful. But it's very difficult, which is why I'm slightly more optimistic. It's very difficult for that to be ignored. Now, if you see, the Chinese in the last 1 week have been trying to dampen down tensions. So they've been trying to disengage with the Indian side on the LSE. There are two super carriers of the US in the South China Sea near the Chinese coast. They've been saying we don't want to rule the world, so on and so forth. So they're trying to go back to Deng Xiaoping's kind of, bide your time and hide your power. But the problem is, once this genie of your naked aggression is out in front of the world, nobody's going to buy that story anymore. Yes, there might be, ebbs and flows in terms of how negative the sentiment is about China. Once the pandemic is over, maybe in a couple of years, the raw kind of visceral, intense attitude about China might lessen a bit. But nonetheless, I don't think this issue is going away anytime any soon. I mean, you can see in Australia, for example, where the Chinese, till 1 week ago, they were making threats saying, even if somebody speaks against China in Australia, so what, right? The Chinese ambassador to the UK just recently said, well, about Huawei indirectly saying there will be consequences. The favorite Chinese diplomatic language word is consequences, And if that is diplomatic niceties, then you have to wonder what is normal everyday conversation. So I think despite the world viewing them as kind of some kind of genius mandarins, they've actually they've really bungled this up badly, and I don't think popular opinion on them can actually change. So conspiracy or no conspiracy, difficult for them to get away with it. Going forward, obviously they did get away with it earlier. The Ashish kind of mentioned the 100-year marathon. It's a good book, I think, by Michael Pillsbury. You can read it. So they had a very clear view, but I think they've just basically shown their hand, perhaps a decade too early. Maybe they did it because Xi was personally very ambitious and he wanted to show the hand before he had to kind of again say that before he anoints his successor. Because you remember, before this was collective leadership in China, everybody was president only for 2 terms. And Xi Jinping kind of broke with it and said there is no successor as of now. So he had to ratchet up the tension. So maybe it was his personal ambition. Maybe it is a very strong realization that the Chinese demographics are finally going south. For example, the 25 to 64 age group peaked in China as a percentage of the total population in 2015. In India, it will probably peak in 2045, whereas it bottomed in both the countries in around 1975. So the Chinese realized that the tailwinds which were really pushing them forward, namely demographics and falling dependency ratios, have very recently and very quickly and very sharply become headwinds. So they understand that this, in terms of relative power ratios, this might be their moment. So over and above any personal ambition, they had to kind of strike now. But this is it. We've seen the worst in terms of humanitarian losses. I hope we've seen the worst. But in terms of them showing their hand, we've seen the worst. And I don't think anybody will buy any kind of niceties from their mouths anymore.
And Harsh had mentioned some of the banking financial companies with sort of links to China, and obviously this is a powerful industry in the US. Surely would have had some influence on US foreign policy. Likewise, there's also the part of academia, American academia, European academia, where China, I think, very cleverly, deliberately sought out sort of opinion shapers, researchers in the hard sciences, and opinion shapers and thinkers in the kind of softer sciences, and they kind of funded them, they cultivated them, and this slice of society had a important role in presenting that image of a benign, a friendly China to the rest of their people. And in a very dramatic fashion, actually, earlier this year, I think it was the head of the Department of Chemistry at Harvard who has been facing an investigation now by US agencies on his links to Chinese universities, whether he got undisclosed income. And this person is a very, very renowned academic in the US. So it was actually a shocking revelation that this was happening. And if I remember correctly, US agencies are now investigating some of the most renowned and premier US universities on their links to Chinese sort of funding and the Chinese government institutions. So the role that these groups also played in kind of providing that cover to China is also, I think, already collapsed or collapsing quickly.
Yeah, there was some crazy statistic on number of percentage of STEM students at US universities, right? Chinese students who were STEM graduates there, and master students and so on. Yeah. So I mean, we've had a wide-ranging discussion on macro policy and all of those things, right? Ashish, I want to come to you and ask, what can common people do to strengthen our stance and stand us in good stead in this sphere of things.
Sure, Carrie. I think we can do a lot in terms of backing up the national stance in that sense. The market is so big that I think even if you substitute your China trade by, let's say, a couple of billions, 3 billions on a yearly basis, even that would be good enough to essentially, as a strong signal to China, right? The public, the fact that China can no longer influence public opinion like what they used to do in earlier. I mean, Russians started this in India in 60s and 70s, and then China probably did it in more later times. I mean, more recent times. The fact is that I think it is getting a little difficult because they can still buy who they want to buy potentially, but there's also going to be a counter argument there, right? Which was missing, let's say, up until say 10 years ago. So now there's so much out there in terms of content and media and opinions that just the monopoly of someone saying that, hey, China is great. I think that, the person is going to be mocked at basically, right? Like, no one seems to be very afraid of China at this point. Like if you go back 20 years, there's a little bit of an aura around what China was doing. Maybe not 20, but say 10 years ago. And I think that's kind of not there anymore. People don't worry about the fact that China has become powerful because India has, although the relative increase is marginal vis-a-vis China, but I think the confidence has been multifold in that sense, saying that we can take on some of these threats. So I think the public opinion is very critical, and as Harsh alluded to earlier, it's probably at its peak in India in terms of the anti-China sentiments. I don't think it's going to change for a while. And in fact, it's a good galvanizing force for the government to take some of the harsh decisions, because even if some things become costlier for a bit, or if, let's say, 200 Indians lose job here or there, I mean, some of those decisions, while of course in a limited sense they are fairly draconian for the individuals who get affected, and hopefully, there'll be other alternatives to take care of those folks. But the fact that the decisions have to be made will be widely accepted. Like even these 59 apps being banned and jobs being lost in India, I think largely speaking, the people were in favor of what the government was doing. So I think it's a momentum play at this stage. Any decision that the government takes which is going to hurt China is probably going to be accepted, generally speaking, irrespective of what the media commentators have to say about it.
And just on that aspect of public opinion, what Ashish has mentioned, I would like to point out, if you see just over the last 4 months, starting in March or April, and till date, and you start from East Asia, that is, if you start from Japan, going down all the way through Hong Kong, Taiwan, then if you go further south, Australia, Indonesia, Myanmar, even Bhutan, and obviously India. I think these are all countries that have faced Chinese aggression in some shape or form, either in the seas, and in India's case, obviously on land. And in Australia's case, there's digital warfare, which the Australian government has talked about, and they have said that we need to recruit and kind of beef up our capabilities in this area because of Chinese aggression. So there is no country on the entire sort of span from Japan through India, or rather there are several countries in that stretch which are directly being challenged or facing aggression from China. So you can imagine what public opinion is building up against such Chinese actions.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is for sure that whole romanticizing this whole China story in terms of growth and whatever will sort of end, right? I mean, some of this coming from people who shout fascism at the drop of a hat itself. I mean, I could never reconcile both those views actually. And the fact that, hey, I mean, we have a better sort of a foe to benchmark against than, you know, some of the failed states who you know, we typically are pitted against, right? So on both those fronts, I mean, I see that as a positive. And yeah, so that kind of brings us to the end of the podcast. Thank you, Ashish, Harsh, and Rajiv for joining us. It's been a fun episode discussing all these things with you. Right. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the podcast. This episode will be available on all popular platforms. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.